I really view GPT as being kind of like the democratization of machine learning and artificial intelligence. This is literally has the ability to be one of the most disruptive technologies I've ever seen. If you're not doing it, somebody's going to do it to you. And this is something that I truly believe that we need to get very, very good at. I believe that if you are not doing stuff with generative AI right now, it will eventually become an existential threat to your business.
James, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, super excited to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. We've got probably well more than an hour, probably several hours, several drinks of content to cover, but we'll just start kind of in the middle. But for those of you who, or for the listeners who don't know you, why don't you just give a quick intro as to who you are, Xactus, and kind of your background?
Yeah, so James Owens. I've been in technology for just about 30 years now. It's something that I'm extremely passionate about. I've had an interesting career. I started off working for two defense contractors as a software engineer, became a software lead, software architect, principal architect, and then finally ended up joining another company that did custom software development, and they were in the commercial space. And it was interesting because at my first two companies, which were khaki and American Management Systems, when I left AMS, I was a principal engineer there. I was kind of a top dog. And when I joined RDA, which was my third company, um, I very quickly realized that I had no idea what I was doing, based upon the caliber of the people that I was now working with. Um, in my mind, it was the difference between being a developer and being a software engineer, right? It's like um, I was all of a sudden around people who were just incredibly talented, incredibly deep into the topic. A lot of these guys and gals had, multiple books published under their name. They were consulted by Microsoft for certain things. I mean, it's just a different species of software development. It was crazy. Literally for the first 6 weeks, or so, well, not 6 weeks, but 6 months, I'm like, I'm getting fired because these guys are talking a language that I just don't understand. But lo and behold, after about 6 months, I kind of realized I was now one of them. I'd kind of learned their language, learned kind of their methodology, started talking the way they talk, and all of a sudden, I felt like I was one of the herd. And it was at that point where I felt like I truly learned probably one of my biggest professional lessons, just really, how to build software in a very effective way. And they kind of had to have that mentality because they did custom software development and they would do it on a fixed price basis. And, you're going to lose your shirt if you're not good at that.
Got to know what you're
And
doing and exactly how you're doing and how much it's going to cost.
yeah, yeah, unfortunately, they were extremely good at doing estimation, extremely good at doing kind of the requirements and all that. We were using Rational Unified Process back then. This is kind of pre Agile, but that's where I really learned like engineering, like true engineering. Um, then my career kind of got a little weird. I ended up, my boss at the time ended up saying, "Hey, you're really good with customers. I want you to, I want you to do sales and kind of help build out a business, like a vertical business." And he's like, let's figure it out together. I'd never done a business plan. I had no idea what a business plan even looked like. And he, Paul, great guy, ended up mentoring me through that process. And ultimately, after doing a bunch of research, I decided that I wanted to focus in financial services, but more specifically, I wanted to focus on mortgage. Um,
And how did you end up at that conclusion of, okay, so you're at a company, you're leveled up, went from developer to software engineer, learned the lingo, have this opportunity to kind of do a verticalized integrated business, and then you say, A, yes, I want to try the opportunity, but B, this is a particular segment, silo, and vertical of mortgage that you decided to lean into.
Yeah. So, again, I did a bunch of research, and ultimately started attending some conferences. And I started going to some mortgage banking conferences. So the primary trade group for the mortgage industry is the Mortgage Banking Association, and I went to several of their conferences, and I was very very lucky to make some friends with folks who had been in the industry a long time, and they kind of mentored me on kind of the ins and outs of the industry, and it very quickly became apparent to me that the mortgage industry is extremely closely held. It's like everybody knows everybody, and the other thing that I found was, from a technology perspective, it was a very, very interesting place to play. There were lots of things that at the time, and this was back in the early 2000s, um, there was uh, it was a very manual operation back then. But what I ended up doing was just kind of learning, spending a lot of time with people, listening, asking lots of questions, and really didn't even try to sell anything at that point. It was just all about kind of like figuring out the mechanics of the industry. But I ended up really, really liking it, and I found it to be a place that was primed for like technology innovation. Ultimately, what I ended up doing was, uh, because the company I was working for at the time, they weren't like a known entity in the mortgage industry, and I was like, well, how are we going to crack this? Because you know, it, I didn't want to be in a position where it was like dialing for dollars, where you're making hundreds of calls to get one meeting, so I realized that I could actually join the Mortgage Bankers Association as a premier member for, like, I think it was $20,000 at the time. And by doing so, you were part of a much smaller piece of the pond, and you got lots of opportunities. All of a sudden, your company's name is out
Kinda
there being
pay for
advertised.
status and then immediately get into the inner
Yeah,
circle
yeah,
and influence.
and we got speaking opportunities at conferences. And what I found is, we went I'd speak at conferences. So they had a technology conference, they had an annual conference, a servicing conference, a secondary marketing conference, and I had an opportunity to go speak at these because we were a premier member. And I would get up there and I would talk about a topic. Like, I seem to remember the first one I talked about was how to use web services, XML web services to, like, do, because back then it was all point to point integration, and it was painful, and it was like, are you going to use DCOM? Are you going to use remote procedure calls? Or I was like, hey, if web services, it's pick your language, but it's a standard now, right? So you can do a integration between systems much more easily that way. And I would go up and give like presentations like this, and people would walk up and just hand me their business cards. So I called it a pull sales versus push sales. Push sales being dialing for dollars.
Inbound versus
Um,
outbound, right.
yeah, and kind of the approach that I implemented was pull sales, where I tried to establish us as being thought leaders. And while my knowledge about the mortgage industry wasn't that great at the time, my knowledge of how to apply technology to solve business problems was pretty solid at that point. So I was able to kind of like transcend, put both those two concepts together. And like I said, I'd go to these conferences, and people would start handing me their business cards because of a talk I gave. And then I started getting opportunities to get published. So there's all kinds of industry rags out there, and I was able to publish a whole bunch of articles, under my name for my company at that point. It was always around the topic of technology solving mortgage
So
problems,
it
and
it's almost as if just to kind of jump in here, you took kind of the domain expertise that you had from the engineering and software side of things, And while you knew that you weren't necessarily going to be the most plugged in, most, educated about the mortgage industry sector, you took your skills that you had, levied that into that particular sector. And so therefore you were talking about what you knew, but with a slightly different lens. And therefore that gave you the credibility, expertise, and kind of domain authority to have this pull of leads, opportunities, and partnerships.
That's absolutely right. And it was interesting because after I had been doing that for a while at the third company, um, one of my customers was, and they went through a bunch of name changes. So back in the day, it was Fidelity National Financial. Then they became Lender Processing Services through a spinoff. Then it became Black Knight Financial Services. Um, I ended up going and working there for 15 years, and they were effectively the Microsoft of the mortgage business. They were the largest provider, or certainly one of the largest providers of technology and services to the mortgage industry. And at that point, my career transformed a little bit because I went from pure technology to doing consulting. And this was the first time in my career where I was really doing like true business level consulting at the mortgage level. And because of the types of customers that they had, I mean, they basically operated, they had top 50 banks out there, including the largest of the large. I had an opportunity to go into, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, all these different companies and help them solve business problems with technology and automation. And it allowed me to understand so much more about how cultures are different. Some of these cultures were, so, some of these banks and lenders were very high touch with their customers. Some of them were very, very tech savvy. Some of them were kind of somewhere in the middle. Um, but just seeing kind of how one thing that worked for this kind of company would fail for a different kind of company just because of how their cultures were set up was super interesting. And the other thing that I got to do was I started running consulting organizations eventually. And I even had a industrial engineering group at one point where we would go in and we would re-engineer operational processes. And it was particularly interesting during the financial crisis because financial crisis, uh, you know, during 2008, 2009, uh, the stress and strain on a lot of these shops, default functions and servicing functions had never been exposed. And I, that's kind of where I really truly understood the idea of if you you can have a bad process, and if it's not under stress or volume, you'll never see the warts. But you put that same process under extreme stress or extreme volume, you're going to find out real quick if it works. And at this point in the industry, we had been preceded by a huge originations boom. So um, all the investment in the industry had been around, uh, not all, but a lot of the investment in the industry had been around originating loans and not a whole lot of investment around the default side of the house simply because defaults were so low prior to the financial crisis. Well, once we hit the financial crisis, a lot of people's stuff were broken. And
Problem solving changes from
oh
more
yeah,
business
yeah.
to how do we deal with defaulting loans.
Yeah, and at that point, we had an opportunity to go in and re-engineer foreclosure processes, bankruptcy processes, collections processes. Just really fascinating time in the industry.
And was this all
Uh,
from the consulting side, or were you also doing implementation as well as the strategy aspect of consulting
the
for these large
the
companies?
the vast majority of what I was doing during this time was around what I'd say process re-engineering consulting, and we'll say executive slash strategic management consulting. Um, but it always had a technology flavor, right? Because part of the solution was always going to be how do we automate this, or how do we use this tool in a better way? Um, but it was fascinating. I mean, we actually even used some uh, process simulation tools where we would go in and capture like existing processes, current state, and we would compare the model against operational reports. And once we got it within a particular tolerance, we're like, okay, this model currently, or the simulation, represents reality now. And we could hit the play button. It was always fascinating for the customers because we hit the play button and you could watch the widgets flow through the system. Mortgage is very much a manufacturing business, and so to kind of watch the to watch the engine flow and things move through it was always fascinating for the customers. But more importantly, the simulation tool would show where the choke points were.
Right.
It's like, this is, here's the problem.
Kind of
It's this
model
thing
the
that's
entire
flat.
factory, see how it's running, and then also see where it breaks down, where the bottlenecks are.
Yeah, yeah. And then we could play what if, right? Then we could go and say, oh, okay, so this is the problem. If we change this, let's watch the simulation again. And then, I'm not saying this was like a perfect solution, but it was a really interesting insurance policy against making a bad decision. One of the things that I found in my career, during this part of my career, there's a huge difference between process engineering and process improvement. A lot of companies were very invested in process improvement. And the way they would solve problems is you'd get a bunch of people in a room and say, hey, we've got this kind of a problem. And somebody would say, well, when I was at this lender, we did it this way and we fixed it. Well, they would make that change, and it might even have gotten worse, right? Just because
Is
culturally,
the difference
mechanically.
between the two process improvement is let's take something that already exists and then just maybe modify or change it, whereas process engineering would be going back and saying, what's the starting point, what's the end objective, and let's reconfigure and reimagine the entire experience. And maybe 70% of it's still the same, but you're still thinking about it from a holistic solution perspective rather than improving an existing process. Is that accurate or is it something else?
Yeah, no, no. I mean, that's absolutely accurate. I would say the process engineering piece, the other thing that really relied heavily on was a quantitative approach. It was very, very numbers based, whereas process improvement was a little bit of an art form, whereas process engineering was more quantitative driven, and you wanted to kind of prove it mathematically that what you were about to do was going to achieve the outcome you desired. Now, it there was a little bit of art form to it still, um, but I always found it to be a much better insurance policy, right? Because we weren't just kind of swagging it in like, hope is not a plan, right?
Right.
So, um, by having these models and such, and running simulations, there was certainly a lot more certainty around what the likely outcome of the investment was going to be. And in many cases, we were asking people to spend, millions of dollars, right? So, I mean, you want to get it right. Um, but so I did a ton of consulting personally. I also did ran a bunch of consulting organizations for Black Knight and lender processing services. Really liked the company. It was a great company. Um, at the very end, I was running part of a sales organization for them and a consulting organization. And then, lo and behold, one of my customers, um, who I had a very, very great relationship with, and I actually had met them and worked with them during the financial crisis, reached out to me and said, "Hey, we're looking for a CTO."
And
Um,
was this your first time exploring the CTO title? Up until then, I mean, the path you went on was, learn to code, learn to actually code and develop solutions, consulting, mortgage, more mortgage expertise, process automation, efficiency, process engineering, like the consulting aspect. So you had all of the kind of skills and prerequisites, but this is the first time really leading your own vision of a technical organization.
yeah, it was kind of an interesting flavor of CTO. So this organization had a CIO, um, and was somebody that I had a ton of respect for. He'd been with this organization for ever, for 25 plus years. he and I always hit it off. I did a lot of work for him when I was at Black Knight, as a management consultant, an executive consultant, technology consultant. I probably did like 7 different consulting engagements for these guys, and just they were based in the Midwest, and they were just like they were a very large player in the consumer lending space, but they were also they had that Midwest flavor.
Yeah.
It was like very family oriented, very everybody was like super nice and easygoing. Um, and he he and I ended up having a discussion, and he brought me in as his chief technology officer. In that particular flavor of the role, I was more of a technology, like an executive technology consultant to him. I would do a lot of special project work. I would do a lot of how can we do, how can we build software better? How can we modernize this system? How can we integrate and do these types of, different things? Um, Ultimately, he ended up leaving the company, and I ended up getting 2 other bosses. So I was at Black Knight for 15 years, 14 years, 15 years. And then I was at this company for roughly 7 years. I had 3 different executives that I reported to during that time. And it was always about kind of modernization of our lending systems. They became, through acquisition, the largest consumer finance company in the United States. Um, Massive technology organization, you know, 5, 6, 700 people at different points. Um, and that's my last boss there, who I can definitely consider a mentor. Engineer, super sharp guy. Taught me a ton about Agile and CI/CD and digital operations and all that type of thing. And the last piece of the gig that I had there was building a credit card company from scratch. They brought in a senior executive, who had a ton of experience in the credit card space. And during COVID, all of us are remote, and we literally built a brand new credit card company from scratch in 9 months. And I've got the original number 1 credit card in my wallet from that company. So it was a really, really cool experience. Um, it was also one of the few times in my career where I've had a blank sheet of paper. We literally started with nothing. I mean,
I mean,
nothing.
that mandate of blank sheet of paper. It's also COVID, so the world has completely changed. And then you're also, I don't know if the mandate was 9 months, but 9 months is a very fast cycle to
Yeah.
ship anything, let alone something that's as large and as complex as a credit card, which has a physical product component to it too.
Oh yeah, yeah. And we had a very clear hypothesis that we were testing out. Um, we knew that we wanted to control the user experience. There were other things that were more commodity, like if you really just think about like transaction servicing, right? That kind of thing. Those are commodities. I mean, the customer is never going to see it.
Get a third party to do it and focus on what makes you guys
Yeah,
unique.
yeah.
But
So
yeah,
so we went and we did a market scan, and we went through a bunch of different third parties, and we ultimately identified somebody who's going to be our credit card processor. You have to have a partner bank sitting behind the scenes, so we had to, kind of line that up. And really, all of our effort was integrating these things together, but more importantly, building out a completely digital mobile experience for the consumer. We really, really wanted, that was like the play.
what was the name of
It was
the card and company and brand?
so the company was One Main Financial, OMF, and the card was called Brightway. And I was working for Larry at the time. Larry's a phenomenal guy. He became the CTO. I was chief architect at this point, and the gentleman they brought in for essentially to be the brains, kind of like the executive leading the credit card effort was Nick Clements, super smart guy. Really liked the way he rolled. Very empowering. We were making decisions, and like we were effectively running like a startup.
Yeah.
So you had this big company with 10,000 people and $20 billion in receivables, and all of a sudden you've got this little pirate ship off on the side, where we built a credit card company, and literally we ran it like a startup, and it was super fast, but it was super fun, and I learned so much about um, you know building software like a startup, truly what Agile meant. But I also learned a lot about myself too. It was a pretty stressful time given COVID and given all this stuff going on. But it was absolutely a blast. So some of the most fun I've had in my career.
Given you've experienced kind of both sides of, startup inside of a larger corporation, but also a larger corporation building software, there are merits to both perspectives. Where do you kind of fall in the synthesis between the two about what maybe startups could do better from an earlier stage, and also enterprises, what could they do better to be more adaptable? Or are they kind of both optimized for their respective buckets, and there's a different playbook, but they both kind of check the boxes for what they need to do?
Yeah, so I've worked for some really, really large companies, and I've worked for some smaller companies. Um, Larger companies, obviously they've got the pocketbooks, so they're not necessarily always worried about funding things. They're able to make chunk size investments, when they feel the need to do so. But I generally find that the decision making and bureaucracy and risk taking um, diminishes as the company becomes larger. Smaller companies may not have necessarily the pocketbooks behind them, but boy, can you make some decisions quickly.
Can move fast.
And that's when you can go fast. You can try a lot of different stuff. So after the credit card company, I ended up getting a call out of the blue from my old boss from Black Knight, and I had known her uh, as she had kind of climbed through the executive ranks, um, and she was very transparent. She was one of the most knowledgeable people that I've met in the industry. I mean, she knows mortgage inside and out. She is an intellectual or a emotional IQ off the charts, and she's just transparent and everything you want in a boss. And I get this call out of the blue right when we had finished up the credit card company, and she's like, "Hey, I left Black Knight. I'm at this new company. I'm the president. I need a CTO." And we talked a little bit, and I was like, "Let's get the band back together." And so now I'm at Xactus, and um, we're at that perfect size, right? We've got um, we basically took 8 companies and put them together to form Xactus, and all of these companies were small to mid-size, middle market type companies that ultimately, when you put them all together, we're now 28% of the total verification market. So we can scale. We're perfectly sized to make very quick decisions, but also able to make investments. So we're at that. In my opinion, this is like the perfect sweet spot.
Best of both worlds, where you
Um,
you can move quickly, but you can also act with authority when you want to, and acquire or
yeah,
staff up or whatever it is. You can act with
yeah,
confidence.
and it was awesome because it's like you rarely do you get to start a new job where you've known your boss enough that literally you can finish sentences for each other. So it's like that first day on the job, there's just this implicit trust, um, and part of part of the hypothesis of putting these companies together was let's build something large enough that we can scale, to support kind of, a large portion of the market if we're successful enough to win that business and such. Um, but it's also the verification industry is very interesting. So let me frame verification, because people hear mortgage and they get mortgage, I think. So the place that we play in is, right now, it's the front part of the mortgage originations process. So you, Elijah, go and you want to buy a house. So you might get a real estate agent. You might get, you know you're poking around, you find a house you like, now you need to get a loan. That's kind of right where we start, right? So the lender, and we support a variety of different types of lenders. So you got the banks, you've got the non-banks, you've got the
Credit
correspondent
unions,
lenders, credit unions, all that kind of
all of
stuff,
them.
right? So we've got roughly 6,600 customers throughout the U.S. Um, but the kind of where we play is, once your lender of choice takes your application, in order for them to underwrite your loan and make credit decisions and things like that, there's a variety of things that they have to validate, or there's data sets that they have to get that help them determine, what kind of rate can I approve this person, et cetera, et cetera. So we play in the mortgage industry is interesting because we're the only industry that requires 3 credit reports. So you've got to get, it's called a tri-merge, and it's the middle score between Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. So we're involved in pulling that data from the credit bureaus and providing that to our customers. We also do verification of employment, verification of income, verification of assets, fraud checks, uh, flood certification checks, and a variety of other things. So all of the things that your lender needs in order to decision your loan and close your loan and price your loan are things that they purchase from us. Um, it's a space that has largely not changed for like 30 years. I mean,
And we're
credit
talking, I mean,
report.
again, one of the simplest examples of a verification is, again, if I'm getting a mortgage, well, I say that I have a job, I say that I make this amount of money. Well, if I'm a bank and lending that amount of money, I want to make sure that you actually have that job and you're still employed.
Yep.
You're employed when you get the
Yep.
loan. And so, to your point, historically, it's someone picking up the phone, calling in, filling out a form, and saying, "Okay, let me talk to your boss or whoever it is," and kind of going through that process. And so, not a whole lot of technology historically has kind of entered into that scene, which is where Xactus, with its consolidations and technology, has been playing.
Yeah, I mean, there are some players out there, that provide automated solutions for that. There's been some changes in the market recently where, um, for a variety of reasons, the way that y- there, like for instance, there's this notion of a waterfall. Some particular products, only have access to so many of the payroll records, and I may check for James Owens in this one and not get a hit, and then
You check
you need to go to the
ADP, and then
next
you
one,
go
right?
to
Yeah, yeah, that
Gusto,
kind of
and
thing.
yep, yep.
You know, but it's in particular the tri-merge credit space. We think there's a huge opportunity to do some differentiation here, and to quite frankly innovate, in ways that the market hasn't seen in a long, long time. So, we consider ourselves a fintech. We don't want to be considered, per se, just a verification company. We want to be considered as a fintech. And one of the mandates, with me coming in was, how can we shift the culture, in such a way that we start acting like a fintech, and really put technology at the tip of the spear, and start doing some really differentiated things with it. Um,
Given that
You
mandate,
know, my
where do you even start to say, okay, well, here's where the culture is, right? And then we know that we have ideas of wanting to be a fintech and be more differentiated and more unique. How do you both make the changes to the organization to achieve those results from a technology perspective, but then also kind of win hearts and minds to start thinking? It's very different to think like a fintech or an agile startup company culture versus just building some stuff, but not shifting the minds while doing so.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is kind of where the merger of my technology and consulting background kind of came together. But the consulting piece was I was very used to looking at operations and kind of figuring out, what's working, what could work better, what would you change to make it work better. And then of course you've got the technology piece. So that came in and, literally just listened and learned and kind of formed some of my own opinions over time. And one of the best things about Xactus, and truly, I I mean, it's one of the things I absolutely love. We are probably one of the most change positive companies I've ever worked for. It's nobody pushes back. Everybody is very open to doing things in a different way as long as you can articulate why. Context is super important, right? So as we've made operational or process changes, specifically around technology, we very much so try to articulate why it's good for our customers, why it's good for the company, why it's good for this part of the organization, and why it's good for you. Um, I'm a huge believer in you can't just tell people what to do. You got to help them understand why and why it matters and how they fit into the bigger picture.
How did you?
Uh,
So it sounds like they were already that way to a degree, but you've leaned even more into that. How do you shift a culture? I mean, that's a pretty complex thing to do. So how? I mean, do you have an example of like, well, this is something we started doing, which we reinforced over time, which led to people being more change positive and kind of having this mindset?
yeah, no, great question. The way I think about culture is the outcome of a collection of common behaviors. And if you can get a group of people behaving in a particular way, you can effectively shift the way um, the culture is performing. So, like when I first came in, and you know, uh, one of the things in my mindset is like there are you know companies don't make bad decisions. Like if they were doing waterfall SDLC when we came in, they were doing it because at the time it was the right thing to do. Um, but I was coming from a position of having seen the power of being a product driven organization and building software um, under Agile SDLC. Huge believer in both of those concepts, and I knew
Software
that I
development
wanted to.
lifecycle for non-technical
Yeah,
people out
yeah,
there, SDLC.
yeah, yeah. But I knew I wanted to shift us in that direction. I thought that was very important, especially if we wanted to be viewed as kind of a fintech. That's what fintechs do. It's kind of modern uh, development methodology. Um, and we got to tiptoed into it. You got to be careful. You can't throw too much change too quickly at an organization. Um, but we talked about some of the things that we wanted to change. We talked about some of the behaviors that we felt would enforce positive outcomes and kind of lean us in that direction. And then we put a plan together. And I was very lucky to have um, just a great organization to deal with. Again, some super smart engineers, really just a talented group of people that were willing to try things differently. Because you have these 8 companies, and these companies have existed for 20, 30, 40 years. And a lot of them were kind of family oriented businesses, and people had done things the same way for a
Right.
long time. You would think that, you know, coming from kind of that perspective, that um, they would be a little hesitant to change. It was exactly the opposite. I was shocked at how change acceptive they were. Um, the other thing is, I'm a huge believer in empowering people. People need to feel like they own what they're doing. Um, and kind of my learned philosophy is, if you think of a boat floating in the water, and above the water line, you can go really, really fast. You can punch as many holes in that boat as you want above the water line. Those are the decisions that you need to push down as far as you can into the organization. Let people own that. You know, we don't need a committee. We don't need this. Just do it. And if it fails, let's learn from it. Let's not do it again, and let's slap some duct tape on it, and try the next thing. It's the ones below the waterline where you punch a hole in is where you sink the ship. Those are the ones we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about, and we're going to kind of manage that risk. So, philosophically, I think for the culture to work the way that I really like seeing a culture work in technology is, you've got to make people feel empowered, and you've got to push that decision making down. It gives them ownership. It gives them the ability to experiment. And I think ultimately it allows the company to operate with greater velocity. So, um,
I think
it's
one
been a fascinating journey. So
yeah,
I've
I
been
mean,
here 2 years.
2 years, and it's been an exciting 2 years in technology. So you've talked about kind of the cultural shift. We've also had tectonic technology shifts with the advent of Gen AI. Obviously, AI has been around for forever. It's not necessarily new, but from the form of
Yeah.
LLMs, it's a very quite different space. And I think there's also far more interesting applications for companies that have some amount of scale and size, such as Xactus. So, what has your philosophy been in the past 2 years, year and a half, in approaching Gen AI, and then maybe anything that you've built with it?
Yeah. No, it's crazy, because when I was at my last job, um, we had a pretty large data analytics group, like 80 data scientists, something crazy like that. Um, and, they had a ton of, I mean, these were like PhDs, and,
The true
MS.
scientist of the technology
Yeah, oh
world.
yeah, oh
Yeah.
yeah. And these guys were building crazy underwriting models using machine learning, artificial intelligence, all that kind of stuff. Um, Really hardcore. By the way, they were and are very, very good at it. Um, when GPT first came out, I think roughly 18 months ago, um, it immediately caught my attention. I was shocked at what you could do with it. Um, and I kind of have drawn a line. It's like pre-GPT and post-GPT, right? So like pre-GPT was like, you got a bunch of PhDs, and a whole bunch of really smart mathematicians and all that kind of stuff. Post-GPT, I really view GPT as being kind of like the democratization of machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Compress the
Um,
timeline, compress the cost, compress the knowledge necessary, and now it's way more ubiquitous or accessible.
yeah, yeah, and I not only on a professional basis, but on a personal basis, I became fascinated with it. And um, I just spent a ton of time learning about, the pros, the cons, playing around the edges of it to see what it was good at, what it wasn't good at. For instance, large language models. are very good at a lot of things. They're terrible at doing mathematics for the most part. Um, if you don't train them in the correct way, they'll hallucinate. I mean, literally just make stuff up. And that continues to be a little bit of a problem that you have to kind of deal with. But, you know, I convinced myself that, you know, I, I, I don't want to just read about this. I want to actually put my hands on it because that's the way I learn is I- if I can touch it and feel it and play with it, I can understand it. Um, so I actually sat down, I wrote a chatbot, started building out a chatbot with it in Python. And I knew that so obviously we have our own platform. It's called Xactus 360. And that basically is what our customers use to interact with us and purchase all of these different data sets and services, etc. Um, we had a large number of standard operating procedures that we had written around it, and I was like, it would be cool if we had an internal chatbot for our own staff where we could use this technology, train it on all these standard operating procedures, and allow people to ask questions and get answers. Um, so we also knew that we did not want to train the public model. We didn't want our proprietary IP being used to train the proprietary model. And if you just went to the Open AI, website and you asked it a question or pasted in a whole bunch of stuff from a corporate document, you're literally training
You're
the
giving them your data
model.
to, yeah.
Yeah, you're
Yep.
giving you're yeah, you're exposing your data. We knew we did not want to do that. Um, so I knew that if I became a subscriber, purchased tokens on a monthly basis and used their API, it would be private. And I also used the API against a local large, so a vector database. So I trained the database using the API, and then ultimately build out an application that we call Zelda. So Xactus is Xactus, and Zelda is actually my English bulldog's or my French bulldog's name. Except it's you know here it's with a Z. Internally at Xactus, it's with an X. So we have an internal chatbot that we've been using now for the better part of 8 months, 9 months. It's called Zelda, and she's been wildly successful. It was really interesting because part of the journey was learning how differently the prompt engineering could affect the behavior. And you know, we we ended up training Zelda, the assistant portion, as literally a French bulldog. So the attendant icon is a picture of my dog, and French bulldogs tend to be a little sassy, so we gave Zelda a personality. So, like at the end of a response, she'll go, woof woof, and then put a paw print or something on it. So there's some clever interactions there. One of the other things that we did is we built in a rating system. So after every response, there's five dog bones, and
Got to keep it thematic.
you can click 1 through 5 dog bones to rate the answer, and if it's three or less, um, we get notified, and that allows us to understand that the quality of the answer was not as good as it should have been, and it gives us an opportunity to change our documentation that we trained the model on. But it's worked out famously so far. Um,
How
you know,
has this
we
shifted the corporation, whether it's employees or the company's attitude towards AI and AI tools? Because a lot of people I talk with, both on the podcast and outside of it, if the bigger the company, the more afraid of generate AI you are, and there can be kind of this. We know we need to do something, but there's this fear of what could go rogue and what's it going to do, and obviously there's obviously concerns around data. So how has this shifted, if at all, your company's ethos and approach to AI?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we are, Zelda was very purposeful because it gave us an opportunity to eat our own dog food first and watch how people used it and watch what it did well and what it didn't do well. Um, we, I don't want to speak for Xactus, but I'll speak as, myself. Um, you know, I believe that if you are not doing stuff with generative AI right now, um, it will eventually become an existential threat to your business. I truly believe that.
If you're not
I've told
doing
my
it,
board,
someone else will be doing it as well. A direct competitor
yeah,
will at some point. Someone will.
yeah. I mean, I've told my board this. I've told my investors this. I've told my CEO and my president this. Um, this is literally has the ability to be one of the most disruptive technologies I've ever seen. Um, and again, if you're not doing it, somebody's going to do it to you. And this is something that I truly believe that we need to get very, very good at. And that's why we've been making investments in this. As soon as GPT 4.0, the latest version came out, I jumped all over it. I've actually got a proof of concept scheduled on my calendar for next week, where I'm literally going to build my first toy with it. Can't say what it is, but it's pretty cool. Yeah, no, this is something that we're very serious about. We've got a 3-year technology roadmap that aligns to the business strategy, and data, ML, AI are huge, huge, huge parts of the way we think about innovation. Um,
How
and it's just fun.
it's so fun. I mean, I'm so obsessed with it personally as well. Um, 3 years though is a pretty chunky roadmap. I feel like not in the sense that it's a bad thing, but I feel like the advance of technology, particularly AI right now, is so rapid that it's hard to even understand what tools will be available in 6 months, which obviously, I mean, you didn't know about GPT 4.0 until 2 weeks ago, right? And now you're already adding something to your roadmap to kind of play with it. So, what's the three? How do you kind of plan for the future while also knowing you have no idea what tools are going to be available to you in 12 months?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. The way I think about roadmaps, so obviously when you're, going into this year, obviously you budget for things that you want to do for, 2024. So obviously you're pretty set around the things that you want to achieve for year one. Year two starts getting a little bit foggier, and then year three is aspirational, right? But there's still things in there that you want to try and get done. The way I think about it is you're going to have to readdress that plan on an ongoing basis. The value of having a 3-year plan is at least you've put the intellectual exercise into thinking about directionally what you're trying to do. And I think of those as either North Stars or bumper guards, right? Because organizations make decisions on a daily basis. Do we want to buy this? Do we want to buy that? Well, if you don't have a roadmap and understand, well, 2 years from now, I really want to be over here versus over here. If you don't have those North Stars in place, even if they're aspirational, you can find yourself creating one-way doors, and that you just don't want to do that. So you know the true value of that plan is you're putting the big ideas on paper, you're prioritizing them, you're staging them across the period of time, and the value of the plan in certain respects diminishes as the plan gets longer, right? Year one is super valuable. Year two is a little bit less valuable. Year three is, aspirational. But again, it gives you those decisional North Stars that allow people to make cogent decisions, you know, to make sure you're constantly moving things in the right direction when you're calling the ball on certain things. That's kind of the way I think about it.
That's super helpful framing because I've always seen them as being very fuzzy, very, what are you actually writing down that if it stays the same for 3 years, you probably are doing something wrong. But I like the
Yeah,
framing of
sure.
it gives you that kind of direction where when you're making decisions now, you can say, does this decision, if I choose path A or path B, is it more aligned, more in that direction of whatever that North Star is? And then you're going to recalibrate, readjust, etc. But it gives you that frame of reference, which I think that's a helpful frame.
Yeah. I mean, it's something as basic as we want to move towards this kind of a database, or we want to move away from this cloud tenant into a different tenant. Putting those on paper just help you directionally make sure that when you're making decisions that you're nudging things in the right way. So
I feel like we could go on for hours and hours, but maybe a close out with a personal question here. For technology, we're again at this very interesting period where there's rapid hyper growth. Is there a particular aspect or idea of AI that excites you the most and you hope to see in, the 1 year or 5 year horizon, whether it's, you could go with simple things of self-driving cars or the movie Her in your pocket where you have a voice AI assistant that's always at your ready. But anything that you're most interested in this kind of expansion and iteration that we're seeing right now?
yeah, I think the thing that we're on the cusp of, and it would not shock me if it were already in kind of beta behind the scenes, unexposed to us yet, is having that personal assistant that um, can actually do things on your behalf, like take actions on your behalf. Um, Part of me is terrified by that concept. Part of me is incredibly excited by the potential. And what I mean by that is, if you could have an assistant where it was linked into your bank account, it had access to your Delta frequent flyer account, so, yada, yada, yada. It could go off and book your vacation for you optimally because it knows you. And you know, the fact that, the latest version of GPT, 4.0, it now has a memory. So it keeps context. You know, that is fascinating to me. But the thing that terrifies me is until we figure out hallucinations, um, I could also see it draining my bank account, or you know, I'm trying to book a flight to Toledo, and I end up getting booked to Beijing or something. You
Also,
know,
phishing will take phishing scams and social engineering will take
oh,
a because say even we resolve the social engineering, if I'm able to interact with James's proxy or James's AI agent, and then I'm able to manipulate it in some way, that can open up. The more power you give to these agents, the more risk you
we're
expose.
we're already tabletopping some infosec kind of thoughts around this. I'm lucky to have a really sharp CISO, and it's something that we talk about all the time. Yeah, it's terrifying. The deep fakes that occurred. We actually were talking about an article a couple of weeks ago where a firm in, I think it was in, where was it? Was it Bangkok? It was something. It was Hong Kong. It was in Hong Kong, where a senior executive had been sent was like a fake video of his executive team with their voices basically telling him to send $25 million to blah, blah, blah.
Wow.
And it was convincing enough that he actually sent
Wow.
$25 million out. Um, so these were deep fakes of, the CFO, the chief operating officer, all these guys like in a conference room with their voices and totally convinced this individual that it was legit. It's The whole offense defense thing for InfoSec has gotten a lot more interesting.
It's an arms race indeed. James, thank you so
Yep.
much for coming on the show. People want to learn more about Xactus or connect with you. Where should they go?
They should go to www.xactus.com, which is Xactus. And if you've got any questions, we'd love to talk to you.
Awesome.
So, Elijah, thank you so much for having me, man.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a blast.